all the comrades, all the friends, artists from Cuba that are participating, especially Comrade Sitaram Shuri, General Secretary of the CPIM, and also Comrade D. Raya, General Secretary of the CPI. My great salute to all of you. Uh, Today, as you said, we are commemorating the 68th anniversary of the assault on Moncada and Carlos Manuel de Céspedes Barracks. There is no doubt that that day in 1953 changed the history of the people of Cuba and the history of the uh, Cuban Revolution. Because although they did not succeed, they showed to the Cuban people and they showed to the world what they wanted to do, what their conviction and the courage that they had to change what it was happening in Cuba. We all know because there are many articles, there are many books of the history of Cuba in which you can find what was the situation in Cuba before 1959. I will not go too deep into this because all of you know what was the situation in Cuba. It was where there were many a huge difference between classes. There was, of course, people who were living good, people linked with the political higher spheres, linked with the companies, linked with the businessmen, linked with the mafia that was in Cuba and came from Miami. But the vast majority of the population in Cuba, the students, the farmers, the workers, they did not have the same rights that the other. The black people in Cuba were discriminated, and this young generation in 1953, 100 years later than the day that the year that Jose Marti, the national hero of Cuba, born, exactly 100 years later, this generation realized that a change in Cuba was needed, and they had the conviction to fight for it. uh, Fidel Castro expressed in the trial that time that history will absolve me. No, and I think that this what is happening today, this video conference, and the lots of expression of solidarity to Cuba, to the Cuban Revolution that have been happening for more than 60 years, and especially at this moment, it is the most valuable proof that this phrase that he said in that moment, the history will absolve him, so that the history exactly absolved him. Friends, I I wanted to reaffirm and confirm that the Cuban Revolution is more alive than ever, that the young generation that is in Cuba is ready and confirmed to fight for the achievements of the revolution. And we will fight and we will defend it until the last consequences. In the recent days, I have been, or we have been witnesses the lots of media and the lots of news and articles that have been published about the situation in Cuba. It is very, let's say, it is very important to know that they, all of them, or most of them, they said that in 62 years of a dictatorship government, or supposed dictatorship government, this is the first time that the people took the streets. This is the first time. So it is important to ask the question, why in 62 of a dictatorship government, only one time the people took the streets? So it is very clear that this is a political manipulated campaign against Cuba. I would like to talk a little bit about what is the current situation in Cuba and what is happening. No, we are on a small island in the Caribbean, in a small island that has an open economy, depending on the changes and depending on what is happening abroad, what is happening in the world. We have to face, of course, the vulnerability that it means, but also we have been forcing to face the impact of a very aggressive pandemic, COVID-19, that have impacted not only small and undeveloped countries, but also development and countries from the first world. In the first time, we could manage the COVID pandemic in a very good manner. We had few cases and we had less deaths. But during the last month, we have had an increase in the number of cases of COVID in Cuba and a higher number of deaths. Of course, we have been forced to manage our scarce resources and allocate it in those areas in which the impact on the pandemic is worst. And it has caused problems to our economy. Add to this, we have to see the impact of the blockade that we have been suffering for more than 60 years. That you all know very well what it means. The problems that we have to import and export foods, medicines, food, and so on. Add to this, during the Trump's administration, the US government has adopted 243 new sanctions, new measures against Cuba. Among them, 55 during the COVID pandemic. They have used the pandemic and the impact of the COVID-19 as an ally to implement what they have wanted to do or what they have wanted to achieve in Cuba. I will read a small part of a thing that I think it's very important, and it is very clear what is the objective of the US government and what is happening now. It is written here. In April 1960, an Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, from US, Lester D. Mallory, expressed in a secret memorandum that have been disqualified later. It says, the majority of Cubans support Castro. The only forcible means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. A line of action which, while as accurate and incompetent as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wage, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. This is exactly what is happening now. This is the objective now. Of course, this pandemic and the blockade and the measures of Trump administration that there are still remain under the current US administration have caused problems in the daily life of Cubans. Even though there are legitimate demands emerging from our people based on these difficulties mentioned that I have just mentioned, because we have suffered interruptions in our electricity services. We have we have shortage of food, we have shortage of medicine, we have shortage of equipments due to all these problems. It is true. It is the truth, and our people are facing these problems. Even though the events that occurred on July 11th in Cuba are not a reflection of a social outbreak, as it has been made out to be. Cuba was made a target of a political mediatic operation orchestrated and financed from the United States, which causes disturbances on a limited scale and did not receive the support of the vast majority of Cubans. It has now been established that the communication operation against Cuba did not arise spontaneously or from its national territory, but was orchestrated from accounts based in US cyberspace. Companies and groups, some with ties to terrorism, that receive financing from the US government. The Cuban government, through its foreign minister, Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, in press conference held on July 13 and 22, has made public the evidence on this and has urged the United States government and the State Department to confirm or disprove this information. It is clear that till now they have not said anything. On July 11, in subsequent days, there was vandalism, violent attacks on institutions such as police stations, headquarters of organizations, shopping centers, and even there were a group that thrown stones at a pediatric hospital. Of course, the authorities of internal order in Cuba, particularly the police, and the revolutionary people of Cuba faced this vandalism and these groups. But it was, of course, with strict adherence to the compliance with the laws established in our country. As part of the disinformation and the manipulation campaign against Cuba, a large number of fake news, gross misrepresentation have been published in important media and also in the social networks. They have tried to amplify what happened in Cuba. They have used images from other countries, like it happened in Cuba. They have used murders, images of murders of minors, and now they are saying, the media are saying that in Cuba there are missing persons. Our foreign ministry and our government have publicly said that in Cuba there is no missing person. And in Cuba, there is no minor that was dead or there are in prison. And if there is anybody, any non-governmental organization or any government from around the world, US or any other, that has one proof, not 2, 3, 4, 5, or 100 cases, like they are saying, that have only one proof of a minor disappear or a person disappear in Cuba, they can show this proof. Of course, until now, nobody has said anything. On June 23, 184 nations of the world once again approved a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly in which they demanded the lifting of the United States blockade against Cuba as a confirmation of the international rejection once again of this act. Just 2 or 3 days ago, over 400 personalities around the world, ex-heads of state, politicians, artists, intellectuals, they have sent a letter to President of US, Joseph Biden. And this letter was published in the New York Times, and they asked them to lift the blockade and lift the 243 sanctions that were approved by the government of Trump to Cuba. In India, we have always counted with your support for many years. We cannot forget the help that you sent to us in the 90s with this big chip of rice that was received from our commander-in-chief Fidel Castro at that difficult times, the special period. We cannot forget the historical position from India against this blockade. And now, today, at this moment that we are talking now, there are many students from all over India in many states demanding the lifting of the blockade, expressing the solidarity to Cuba. From states from the south, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and also from the north here in Delhi, or from the east in Assam, for example. We are very grateful for your support, for your solidarity to Cuba, and I can confirm and reaffirm that we will fight until the last consequences, defending our revolution and defending our project. Why? Because we know and we feel and we think that the socialism is the only way to construct a better world which is we have more justice for the people. Thank you very much, Arun, and thank you very much to all of you.
Hello, Arun. Arun? Nilu? Are you there? Arun?
Comrade Sida, you can start.
Oh,
Comrade
baby.
Sida, you can start.
Baby, where are you? Huh?
I am in Trivandrum.
No, I know. I can't see you on the screen. Good.
Yeah. Being old convener, I
know.
request you
to yeah.
Open this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Comrade Juan Carlos Markov, or should I call you the Excellency, the Charge Affairs of Cuba to India, and a comrade of ours, and other comrades present here. Comrade Baby is a former convener of the National Committee for Solidarity with Cuba, and the All India Peace and Solidarity Organization's General Secretary, Comrade Nilotpal Basu, member of the Presidium of the AIPSO and the Secretary of the Solidarity Committee, Comrade D. Raja, General Secretary of the CPI, Comrade Kavita Krishnan, Politburo member of the CPI-ML, and the other important personalities and leaders that are present here. At the outset, I mean, we heard a very detailed description of what is currently happening in Cuba from Comrade Juan Carlos. And I think there is no need to repeat what all details he said. And it's a lot of information which many of us had known partly in various bits and fits and things, but the whole jigsaw puzzle fits in as it always fits in with Cuba for the last 6 decades or more, that it is the inability of US imperialism to come to terms of having a socialist Cuba so close to its borders. And that is something it has never accepted, and it is something that it has continuously sought to destroy. But for 60 years or more, almost our age, I mean, when the time when we were being born, yes, on this Moncada Day, when we all say history will absolve me and remember Fidel's very moving, inspiring speech, we all today must recognize that history has not merely absolved Fidel Castro, but history has vindicated the Cuban Revolution. It is a day of vindication, not only a day of absolving, it is a day of vindication that the Cuban Revolution has been vindicated. It's lasted for more than 60 years. It will continue to last. As when we, in our youth, were walking down the Malecon, we could see a huge poster, I mean, a hoarding, there saying that David finally defeats the Goliath. And that has happened for these decades, and it will continue to happen. Yes, all of us are aware. We are here to express our solidarity like we have done in the past, and we want to do it again in a very big way now, but for the circumstances and conditions. And this blockade that is preventing us from doing what we had done in the 90s by sending a shipload of food grains. The Caribbean Princess, that was the name of the ship that Comrade Fidel Castro received. And when with Comrade Harkishan Singh Surjit, General Secretary then, and maybe he was also present at that receiving of the ship. And after that, we sent some detergents to Cuba, which was a shortage and in 1994, after that, when I went again with Comrade Jyoti Basu, we were hearing the Cubans talking of the Surjit soap. The soap was called the Surjit soap because that was the detergents that were sent from here. But we went through very, very serious different conditions. But today, what is happening is very clear. US imperialism has found, after this entire economic blockade has not produced the results it wanted, it sees a new opportunity in this situation of COVID pandemic. It wants to strangulate Cuba. And the COVID pandemic is sought to be utilized in order to ensure that the medical problems, the health problems of the people of Cuba are imposed over and above the economic problems and this stifling of its development that is happening due to the criminal blockade. And this was precisely what Donald Trump's entire vision was, that this is an opportunity, COVID, use it to the hilt to try and destroy Cuba. That's why Fidel Castro used to always tell the world that it is easier for Cuba to deal with a Republican president because we know what he thinks and what he does. It's more difficult with a Democrat who says something else but does exactly what the Republican is doing. And that is what Biden is doing as far as the 243 sanctions that Trump had imposed that still continue to remain in force. To be true to the world as a Democrat, if the US president, but then US imperialism, as we always maintain, is like a leopard that can never change its spots. Its intention is clear, and it, with the invoking of the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, they have tightened the sanctions even further, and denial of import of food, raw materials, energy, and the sources of foreign exchange, medicines, life-saving medical equipment. This is absolutely criminal at the time of the COVID pandemic. And this is something we all need to come together to fight, because in the name of promoting democracy in the world, of upholding human rights in the world, the worst crime against humanity is being committed by denying people access to medical aid when they need it most in order to save lives. Nobody is asking for any donation from the United States of America. All we are saying is lift your blockade so that what is legitimate that wants to go to Cuba can go. If I want to send syringes today, where there is a short supply in Cuba, that is not allowed to reach there to Cuba. But today, heartening news, we heard that some aid from Russia and China is reaching Cuba. We hope that happens and the world and many of these countries break this blockade. And to save human life, which I think is the ultimate noble aim of humanism and of human feeling and empathy. So therefore, today, in this situation, we are aware and uh, very concerned that the warning came from the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba, the President of the Republic, Comrade Miguel Bermudez, way back in 2019, that this is the plan of US imperialism to stifle Cuba. And this is turning out to be true. On the one hand, stifling Cuba, on the other hand, promoting orchestrated unrest in the country. And this, we have seen, their past masters at it, the US imperialism, of using or misusing the social media, misusing and creating urban campaigns of clandestine radio broadcasts, and in order to rouse the people into some sort of an opposition. As always, Cuba has always faced this situation, but in this situation, it's much more serious. The civil defense committees that the Cuban society and the state and the Cuban party set up in order to face these sort of attacks. Once again, my information is that they are working excellently in trying to actually to get the real and the correct news to the people, and to stop this sort of an orchestrated demonstrations against the government and the legitimate government of Cuba, of the Republic of Cuba. But what we are more concerned is this growth in the COVID cases at the moment. What we have heard, and we've been, the whole world was actually appreciating the manner in which Cuba had contained the pandemic in the initial phase stages, not only contained the pandemic, but also sent international brigades of doctors and medical equipment to more than 50 countries in the world to tackle the situation. Cuba's international solidarity, whether it is for the national liberation struggles in Africa in the past, or for education, for spreading of literacy, or now for health, most importantly. And its advances in very advanced areas of health and medicine, particularly neurosciences, areas which nobody else had really embarked into. In spite of all these things, even the international brigades are now not being allowed to go. Now, this is absolutely cruel. In this situation, if you're trying to use the pandemic in order to attack and weaken socialist Cuba, that is something the world cannot accept and it shall not tolerate. So therefore, we would like to inform through the Solidarity Committee, through the AIPSO, and as the Communist Party of India Marxist, would like to convey to the people of Cuba, through Comrade Juan Carlos, to the government of Cuba, the solidarity of a big cross-section of Indian people with Cuba, given the pandemic conditions, and you know the pandemic situation in India as well. We're only hoping that we won't get attacked by an onslaught of a more vicious third wave. And vaccinations, we need to prepare. And we are very, very impressed with the fact that Cuba has produced its own vaccine candidates. And two of them, we are told, is extremely efficient. Reaching up to 90, more than 90% protection rate of against COVID. But instead of the world using these advances, US imperialism is ensuring that these advances don't reach the people who need it the most. Africa needs it the most, Latin America needs it the most, and Cuba can easily produce and supply to them humanitarian cause. If you want to uphold human values, if you want to uphold democracy, what you're doing with Cuba is the exact opposite. US imperialism must be told. And international pressure will have to be built in this direction. And we as a CPIM and part of the committee, both these committees are fully fully prepared, not really prepared, would take the initiative to do it, and we'll just see what will be the opportunities by which some material help can also be provided to Cuba. So please, on behalf of all of us, my party, these committees, and the cross-section of people, convey to the Cuban people our solidarity. The Cuban Revolution cannot be defeated. That is the message that we would like to convey to the Cuban people and the Communist Party in Cuba. My salutes to all of you.
Thank you, Comrade Sitaram. Now, I request Comrade Raja to speak. After that, Comrade Enram. After Comrade Raja, then Enram will be the next speaker.
Comrade Carlos from Cuba, comrades and friends. At the outset, on behalf of our party, the Communist Party of India, I express our solidarity with the people of Cuba and extend our support to the people of Cuba at a critical time, not only in the history of Cuba, but in the history of the world. What Cuba needs today, according to me, is the political support at international level. And as Communist Party of India, I do believe we must strive for mobilizing strong public opinion, public support within our own country, India, for Cuba. Despite political changes, despite change of government in India, I think we have to mobilize our people in support, in solidarity with the people of Cuba. Cuba is not just a small country in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba is socialist Cuba. Cuba is symbol of struggle for a new world. Cuba is symbol of socialism. That is the thing which is haunting the United States of America. I had been to Cuba 3 times. In the year 1978, I was in Cuba participating in the World Festival of Youth and Students. I could see Comrade Fidel Castro addressing the world youth. It was Comrade Fidel Castro who was such a great speaker, mesmerizing everybody. And he gave a picture of Cuba and the historic struggle of people of Cuba and Cuba's determination to build socialism, Cuba's determination to fight against imperialist powers, whoever may be. In 1998, again I had been to Cuba. That was the time the Communist Party of Cuba organized an international seminar, Socialism in 21st Century. And I could see the leaders of Communist Party of Cuba, the ideologues, the scholars who gathered there, expressing their views and praising Cuba for its very determined, very clear understanding of building socialism in Cuba. Finally, I had been to Cuba when Comrade Fidel Castro passed away. Even during such a gloomy, sorrowful atmosphere, we could witness the people of Cuba coming together, rising to the occasion, standing a solid rock and expressing their commitment and strong will in safeguarding socialism, in safeguarding revolution in Cuba. Comrades, friends, we all know there is resolution passed by United Nations General Assembly. Again, I must give my own personal experience. Between 2007 to 2013, I went to United Nations for 2 times. First time, I had to speak, address the General Assembly in expressing the support to the people of Africa, explaining the India's contribution to the African Fund. Later on, I went to United Nations. I was asked to address the General Assembly on behalf of India. And it was the time the General Assembly was discussing the resolution demanding an end to the economic blockade against Cuba. I spoke for the people of India. I spoke for India, and I expressed our strong support, and I demanded a blockade should be removed and ended, and no concession or compromise on this issue. Economic blockade against Cuba should go. This is what we spoke. Then there was voting. The foreign minister of Cuba was present in the General Assembly. There was vote. Only 2 countries opposed the resolution. One, United States of America. The other one, Israel. Now we should understand the role of United States of America, role of countries like Israel, and they continue to pursue this policy and continue to have economic blockade against Cuba. We can talk about COVID-19. We can claim it is an unprecedented health crisis. International community will have to fight it collectively. Every country has a responsibility, but the imperialists, particularly the US imperialism, does not agree to this. If they agree to the concern of the international community, by this time, they should have lifted the economic blockade against Cuba. And recently, there were demonstrations. I strongly condemn those demonstrations because they were instigated by US. It is known to the whole world, but the government of Cuba, the leadership of the Communist Party of Cuba, they were so concerned and responsible. They tried to address their problems, why people are agitating, and they tried to help the people. They tried to explain the situation. Now Cuba stands united, and Cuba will stand united, and Cuba will continue its fight against imperialist powers, come what may. And because Cuban system, a socialist system, which we all know how it is functioning. And I could see, irrespective of color, race, the Cuban government ensured a harmonious life in Cuba and the Communist Party of Cuba inculcated such values in the minds of Cuban people, and they have been living as children of one family. Now, the US imperialists want to create some rift, some conflict. I know what is going on in Miami, where you have good number of Cuban people migrated. So US imperialism is interfering in the affairs of Cuba at every point of time since the Cuban Revolution succeeded. And that's what we should understand. And while we pay respects to Comrade Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and all revolutionaries of Cuba, and we should highlight and we should see the role played by these revolutionaries. It was everybody was referring to it. Fidel has said history will absolve. History will absolve all communists who are fighting for a new world, free from wars, free from hunger, and where people will live in harmony and happiness. And such ideal will be understood by history, and history will absolve if imperialist powers charge the communists or instigate violence against communists. And that is where what Cuba needs today, I understand, it is political support given to the people of Cuba, their own strength, inherent strength, and they will overcome any situation. But the problem is political. The US imperialist power is just 90 miles away from the Cuban coast, and they are interfering in the affairs of Cuba. They want to subvert the Cuban system. They want to create troubles at all times, and this must be condemned, and this must be stopped. This must be stopped. As India, I think, I am confident we can rally the people of India demanding the end of economic blockade against Cuba. And whatever may be the government, despite the change of government in India, we stand by the people of Cuba. We stand by Cuba, and we will not hesitate to condemn whoever may be if they don't support Cuba at this point of time. So friends and comrades, Cuba is passing through a very critical time, and at this point of time, it is the task of all peace-loving forces, all democratic forces across the world to raise their voice in support of Cuba, express their solidarity to the people of Cuba. And Cuban Revolution has succeeded, and despite all efforts from US imperialism to instigate counter-revolution, that is not going to succeed. Fidel Castro himself gave that historic call, socialism or death. People chose socialism, and they said they are prepared to face death in order to protect socialism. That is the determination. That is the will of the people of Cuba. And so Cuba will stand up, and Cuba will continue to struggle, and the socialism in Cuba will be safeguarded and protected by the people of Cuba. But Cuba has to pay heavy price, and Cuba has to go through sufferings. And there comes the question of political support from international community. I assure the Comrade Carlos from Cuban Embassy, and through him, the people of Cuba, the Communist Party of Cuba, that in India, there are forces which are fighting in support of Cuba, in solidarity with Cuba, and we will not give up, or we will not keep quiet in fighting for the people of Cuba, and we will not succumb to whatever the pressures come from the change of government in our own country. We know what is the character of our government in today's condition, but we will stand up for the people of Cuba. Finally, whenever I think of Cuba, I always think of Comrade Jose Marti, who said, action is the best word. So we can express sympathy, we can express solidarity, we can express support, but what is the action? What is the action? That is what we should think over. The Solidarity Committee, AIPSO, all these organizations must take up the issue, come on the streets, mobilize the public, the same way Communist Party of India, all the left and democratic forces must speak out loudly what is happening to Cuba. It should be condemned, and US imperialist power needs to be condemned, and the world will have to stand up together for the cause of Cuba. That's what I think we should think over. And once again, I assure not only my party support, the support of people of India to the people of Cuba and to the Communist Party of Cuba. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Raja. As Comrade Raja was in fact mentioning when he was speaking, whenever the delegations of members of parliament who are part of this National Committee for Solidarity with Cuba participated in the United Nations votes, particularly when the vote had come in support of Cuba, we had our MPs like Nilotpal Basu, M.A. Baby, and Comrade Sitaram Yechuri, whenever they were members of parliament, they had ensured that India voted in favor of Cuba and against United States. Now I request Comrade Enram to speak. After that will be Comrade Kavita Krishnan. Comrade Ram.
One second.
Friends, it's an honor to participate in this meeting to express solidarity with Cuba, which we greatly admire. I've been to Cuba a couple of times, and I was privileged to have a part in the efforts in the 1990s to meaningfully support Cuba at a time when the Soviet Union had collapsed and there were certain difficulties. But we were very pleased that Cuba, through its own effort, but also helped by solidarity efforts around the world, was able to tide over those difficulties or even crises. Today it is clear that this is a renewed offensive by US imperialism. When the news appeared that there were some protests on the streets, people may have wondered what was happening, but quickly it became clear that this was a manufactured event. And now we know that a lot of the manufacture was done in Florida, in Miami, at that point of time. We note with satisfaction that the leadership of the Cuban Communist Party of Cuba and the state have managed to respond to this, not with repression, as would often be alleged about socialist countries, but in an empathetic way, with the president and first secretary of the Communist Party, Cuba, joining the people on the streets and explaining to them the realities. I think it is shameful that much of the Western media, I read the New York Times, the Washington Post and others, were very superficial in their coverage of what was happening when they were not being propagandistic. One report in the New York Times said people at last had woken up and so on, but what they call the sanctions didn't help. When I visited Cuba, I became aware of the distinction between the term sanctions and blockade, because often I think the word sanctions was used, which is a tremendous underestimation of what had actually been unleashed, not once or twice, but continuously over, now it comes to over 60 years, because the blockade, I believe, was imposed on October 19, 1960, and it has continued. I think no other country, big or small, has faced this kind of blockade, this kind of economic, financial, offensive, political thuggery, I would say, very often, because the methods used initially to overthrow or destabilize Cuba and overthrow the Cuban government, the leadership, assassination attempts, the Bay of Pig invasion of April 1961, which was successfully defeated and anticipated perhaps and defeated, attempts over time, whether it's that was done under the presidency of John F. Kennedy, you'll remember, Bay of Pigs, but successive attempts by Democrats as well as Republican presidents. Whether the Congress was controlled, the majority was Republican or Democrat, there may have been some differences in degree or nuance, but in kind, there was absolutely no difference, because this was the policy of US imperialism. So I think what we first honor and salute is the resistance and the fight back by the people of Cuba, now numbering, we'll learn about just over 11 million, led by the Communist Party of Cuba, spearheaded by Comrade Fidel Castro. And we were thrilled when we were able to see him when I attended Cuba and hear him that time, and his successors as well have successfully carried the torch. This is a remarkable achievement by any stretch of the imagination, to be able to face these interventions through blockades, assassination attempts, invasions, infiltrations, and propaganda campaigns as well, just lies, time and again, about what was happening. I think propaganda needs to be special, we should need to pick out the elements of propaganda today, the lies, and expose them, because misinformation and disinformation are rampant across the world, across most countries in the world, including in India. And just see how the coverage has been of what has happened. Fortunately, other things have taken over. Otherwise, they would have gone to town on for people coming out on the streets, I think on July 17th, I believe. So I think it's very important for us, speaking as somebody working in the media, who's worked in the media and journalism, to figure out what happened, to study what happened, to learn from reliable sources what happened, and in particular from government sources in Cuba, what happened, and explain to people, not just through webinars, but in schools and colleges, wherever the opportunity arises, and in the public sphere, through the media, to the extent this can be, we can send this message across what is really happening, and expose disinformation of the most toxic kind. I would make a distinction between misinformation. Some people are misguided, they don't know better. It may not be motivated or it is not deliberate, but disinformation, which comes straight from Washington, DC, and their think tanks and so on, from the White House and its groups, that is what has gone all over the world. And we are pleased to see that the Communist Party of Cuba and the government of Cuba, its leaders, have been able to meet the challenge, rise to the challenge, and at least overcome some of these obstacles. What has been unleashed against Cuba over the long term includes terrorism, includes extreme crimes, narcotic offenses, and so on. And I don't think any other country, after the original attempts to drown the Bolshevik Revolution in blood, or the Korean War, or the attacks on China, after those attempts, I think Vietnam, of course, a glorious struggle. I don't think any other country has faced this kind of continuous offensive by imperialism, which, and I was looking at some of the justifications, because reference was made to the Trump sanctions, part of the blockade, and the 50 that Carlos mentioned during the pandemic itself. But some of the justifications given by the US government, just a short list. On October 26, 2020, they imposed, the Treasury prohibited Cuban military from processing remittance-related transactions. And the justification was that Cuba's military-run institutions take advantage of ordinary Cubans who rely on remittances, extracting fees for the Cuban military's own benefit. Now, first of all, this is just propaganda. But for argument's sake, even if citizens contributed to the military effort, we should only praise them. What is wrong with that? So then they go on to say, the Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, the Cuban people should have the freedom to decide what to do with their own money without interference from the military. So the US can interfere with what the Cuban people are allowed to do with their own money, but without interference from the military. So this is a kind of thin justification that is being put out. Again, on September 23rd, 2020, US Treasury amends regulations to restrict revenue sources to the Cuban regime. There, the justification is the Cuban regime has been redirecting revenue from authorized US travel for its own benefit, often at the expense of the Cuban people. See, who is speaking on behalf of the Cuban people all the time here? And September 6, 2019, Treasury issues changes to strengthen Cuba's sanctions rules. So through these regulatory amendments, Treasury is denying Cuba access to hard currency. And we are curbing the Cuban government's bad behavior while continuing to support the long-suffering people of Cuba. See who's speaking for them. Similarly, June 4, 2019, Treasury and Commerce implement changes to Cuban sanctions rules. Then on November 8, 2017, this is all after Trump was elected and became president. Treasury, Commerce, and State implement changes to the Cuba sanction rules. And there's a fact sheet here, which again speaks of State Department taking steps to channel economic activities away from the Cuban military, intelligence, and security services. And here comes an important point. While maintaining opportunities for Americans to engage in authorized travel to Cuba and support the private small business sector in Cuba. And then you go back to 1996 to Public Law 104, 114, where it says the consistent policy of the US towards Cuba since the beginning of the Castro regime, carried out by both Democratic and Republican administrations, has sought to keep faith with the people of Cuba and has been effective in sanctioning the Castro regime and so on. And then they list the steps. So there can be no doubt that what is being sold as sanctions to the people of the United States is based on lies and based on blatantly unacceptable arguments that we speak for the Cuban people, their military, their government does not represent them. And we have every right to indulge in all these activities in the name of sanctions. This is outrageous. And I think some of these truths, some of the details have to be brought out in India and in particular. I know that there are campaigns in the UK, US, and European countries and so on. There have been webinars. I got invited to one, I think it is today, that we need to do much more. And I liked the approach of the First Secretary as well as the Cuban Foreign Minister in responding to this vicious attacks. Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez pointed out that between April 2019 and December 2020, the Cuban government lost $9.1 billion on account of the blockade. That is 436 million US dollars per month. And he computed that the accumulated damages over 6 decades at current prices was 147.8 billion US dollars. And if you measure it against the price of gold, it would amount to 1.3 trillion US dollars. And these are facts that I think have to be brought to the fore, brought to the picture. And I think it's time to step up the activities of Solidarity, the National Committee for Solidarity with Cuba, as well as the All India Peace and Solidarity Organization. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but we greatly appreciate what we learned today from His Excellency, who's represented Cuba here, as from our political leaders. Thank you for the opportunity, and I assure you that we will continue to be steadfast in supporting Cuba, in expressing our solidarity with Cuba, doing whatever we can in practical ways to. We owe it to history. We owe it to our own people. We owe it to the people of Cuba, and I'm very pleased that there is this new renewal of solidarity today. Thank you, Arun.
Thank you, Comrade Ram. I'm referring to Comrade Ram as Comrade Ram because of his association with the student movement in his student days. And now he is also the chairman of the Hindu group of publications, which is one of the most important English dailies in our country. Now I request Comrade Kavita Krishnan, the Politburo member of Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist Liberation.
Thank you, Comrade Arun. And at the outset, I'd like to say that I'm extremely happy to have been able to hear His Excellency, the Deputy Ambassador, as well as our comrades from the CPI and CPIM, Comrade Sitaram, Comrade D. Raja, and in Ram's presentation also, which has just preceded mine. I'm very happy to have been able to hear that. And I also greet all the other participants here from various Indian political parties, as well as trade unions and other organizations. And I just want to say right at the outset that I think, the fact that we are having this meeting at this particular juncture, when the whole world has just witnessed this year-long pandemic, which has presented to the entire world unprecedented challenges, and which has highlighted before the world several things, one of which is the fact that healthcare cannot be something which is simply a private good, which you say that, all right, I will give you insurance for, and then you will go and buy in the market, because a pandemic cannot be dealt with as something which is something that individuals buy and sell, right? You can address it only through a public health policy, and any society or the entire world is only as protected from a virus as the weakest person in that world is protected. So the fact that it is a public good to protect everyone, This is not just some kind of dogma, communist dogma, or whatever it is which propagandists would claim, but it is a reality which people around the world are realizing. There are voices around the world that are saying, just as vaccines are being given out free in so many countries, all healthcare should be provided free in that way. At that juncture, here we are having to stand in defense of a tiny nation that, with all the challenges that it has faced since its birth in a remarkable revolution, this is a country that has actually shown the world how you can actually not only privilege healthcare for your own people, but even with the very, very tiny resources that you have, it has set an example of how it can make free healthcare, a model of healthcare, its barefoot doctors, ambassadors to the world. Now, that country today, connected to this appalling imperial blockade, which is, it is being subjected to this cruelty at a time when it has actually spent the whole of last year helping as many nations as it could, especially in its neighborhood. And poor countries who have otherwise, whose access to vaccines, for instance, has actually been blockaded by, for instance, Venezuela. Problems have been created in view of Venezuela's access to COVAX vaccines and things like that. So in that circumstance, Cuba's very existence is important, not only as, of course, as a socialist nation, as a nation committed to those values for which we fight, but also in terms of its role in actually combating this global pandemic. So America's attitude at this time, the United States of America's attitude is at this time towards a country that is in its own neighborhood, is that it does not care about what lives are lost, not just Cuban lives, but all lives all over the world. It is interested in enforcing this cruelty, this punitive blockade, and punishing the people of Cuba for being what the great Latin American writer Eduardo Galeano described as one of the only countries in the world that is not in the race to prove itself to be the doormat of the world. So it is what Cuba is being, and let's be very clear that is what Cuba is being punished for. The idea that protests in Cuba cannot ever happen, and there can't be protests against a government. Of course, there can be, and there should be, and I'm sure there are genuine protests over various issues. But the idea that a protest against that people's feelings against this, the tremendous hardships to which they are being subjected, towards the lack of access to vaccines, even though Cuba is one of the countries that has produced vaccines very early, but its access to those vaccines being recognized is being delayed. But the point is that the fact that people are subjected to power outages and other hardships, the idea that should be framed as saying, all right, that means that people are demanding, freedom from socialism. And that is the answer. This is something that is propaganda. Because if anybody in Cuba is indeed saying that, clearly they are misled. Because the vast majority of Cuban people, and anybody with any common sense, would recognize that a country that is subjected to this kind of imperial blockade, how on earth could you argue that its economic hardships are not related to this blockade? That somehow this government is to blame and this and that. One final point which I'll make, because I don't want to take very much time in this heartfelt expression of solidarity from this part of the world, from women in the subcontinent, from the Indian women's movement, as well as the left movement, of course. One last point which I'd like to make is that right now the entire world is watching. The idea that America says, okay, we are imposing these sanctions because Cuba is not democratic. What is the closest ally in the world right now of the US, Israel? It has been exposed just now as exporting technology quite actively. Its own elected leadership is busy peddling a software which has been used to turn people's cell phones, smartphones, into devices that will spy on them in their bedrooms and their bathrooms. It has been used to spy on world leaders, elected world leaders. It has been used to spy on human rights activists. It has been used to kill journalists. And who used it to kill journalists? Another great ally of the US is Saudi Arabia. So in these circumstances, the idea that Cuba, whose only fault, Cuba has not tried to wage war on any country, Cuba has not tried to harm any country. Cuba's only fault is that it has tried to be a country that lives according to something that says people first, not profit first. So I will end again with the words that Galliano used about Cuba, because I think they beautifully, and I would point anyone listening to us outside this meeting on Facebook and so on to please look up what even critics of Cuba have had to say about Cuba. So, Galliano cites various critics and says maybe they have a point, but then he says that these critics don't say that this revolution, which grew up always punished, amounted to what it could under the circumstances instead of to what it wanted. Nor do they say that the size of the wall between desire and reality got bigger and thicker, in large part thanks to the imperial blockade. So today in India, when Indian people have suffered, had much better resources, could have done much better, but instead, completely sabotaged their own, our own response to the pandemic, left our people completely unprotected in the face of the pandemic. Let us salute Cuba for what it has managed to achieve in the past year, stand in solidarity with Cuba, and certainly stand in solidarity with Cuban people against any kind of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda, which tries to imply that its hardships and the difficulties it faces are due to socialism rather than due to an imperial blockade.
Thank you, Comrade Kavita. Comrade, I need to inform you that Siddharth Varadarajan, who has joined the meeting, is facing some internet issues. So he is unable to join again. He is trying to get into the meeting. Once he gets into the meeting, we will ask him to share his thoughts also. And similarly, Manoj Jha, the spokesperson of RJD and a member of the Rajya Sabha, he had a prior meeting scheduled. So he says that once the meeting is over, he will also join the meeting, and he is always with Cuba, and he has expressed his solidarity with Cuba. Now I request Comrade Shashi Kumar, who is a well-known media personality who had introduced new technology to India, and also the founder and chairman of Asian School of Journalism. He's an actor, he's a director, he's a man of various hats, and he is also a friend of Cuba, Comrade Shashi Kumar. After that, it will be Comrade Manoj Bhattacharya, General Secretary of RSP.
Thank you, Comrade Arun. I think it was Marx who said that history repeats itself, first as tragedy and then as farce. What we're seeing now in Cuba, the orchestrated demonstrations, or largely orchestrated demonstrations, seem to bear out the latter part of history repeating itself for the nth time as a farce. It has repeated itself as a tragedy in Cuba multifold times, many times, manifold times. We've had the special period. We've seen, as Ram rightly put it, it's not just an embargo. It's not a sanction. It is what it is. It should be called what it is. It is a blockade. And a blockade, even in the United Nations, is defined as an act of war. It is an act of war on the world. When, for the 29th successive time, in the UN, in the Assembly, 184 nations move for removal of sanctions, removal of the blockade, and just 2 nations insist that the blockade should be in place, as mentioned, the United States and Israel. It is 2 nations versus the rest of the world. And Cuba belongs to the rest of the world. Where does democracy lie, and where does authoritarianism, totalitarianism, arbitrariness lie? This is very clear. In Cuba, I think it may not be fair to say that there was no demonstration, there was no restlessness because of the pandemic, because of the strictures, because of the economic hardships, because of the deprivations. Look at the formula. It is an American, exceptionalist formula, a US exceptionalist formula. You impose embargo, in this case, a blockade for 62 years. You starve the people. You don't allow the people to, go about their lives. And when the people get restless, and it's compounded in this case, when there's a tipping point because of a coronavirus problem, and the people come out to the streets, you exaggerate it, you compound it, you try and fish in troubled waters, and you say the people want a regime change. This was the formula. This is the formula that the US applied in Iraq. This is the formula the US applied in Libya. This is the formula the US applied in Egypt against the Arab uprising when they supported Hosni Mubarak and now continue to support Sisi. In order to destroy democratically elected regimes. And in Cuba is the arch example of this. Cuba is the archetypal example of the US using blockade in order to bring about a regime change. And they must be feeling terribly frustrated and upset that after 6 decades and a series of attempts, including deploying the CIA, including assassination attempts, including invasion attempts, including sabotage, it hasn't succeeded. And therefore, it's a farce. It's a farce again, as recently as 2017. Cuba is not also a begging bowl of the world. Cuba is not, in spite of this, and that is where the dignity and honor of Cuba is stunning, is admirable. In 2017, of the 62 countries that the Cuban Medical Brigade went and worked in, their services were offered free to half of them. Cuba was actually offering its medical services, its medical brigade, to the rest of the world, half of them free of cost. So Cuba holds its head high under duress, under such deprived conditions. And that is, I think, what is admirable about Cuba. And imagine the kind of argument, the lopsided, the perverse, shall we say, upended argument that the United States comes up with, particularly the right in the United States. We see the argument being made that the right wing, the Heritage Foundation, for example, in 1994 says, and I quote, "The US must not abandon the Cuban people by relaxing or lifting the trade embargo." Where are the Cuban people? That mafiosi which resides in South Florida? Where are the Cuban people? The 11 million Cuban people who live on this island with dignity have been fighting off all that the world has, particularly imperialism has brought upon them. The argument is the US must not abandon the Cuban people by relaxing or lifting the trade embargo. Now you see how ridiculous this is, how patently false, hypocritical, and anti-democratic, and absolutely inhuman this whole argument is. This is what Cuba has been facing. And the pandemic, of course, comes as a compounding kind of a factor in all of this. And Cuba has been trying its best to fight the pandemic. And the fact that it hasn't capitulated is itself, I think, a testimony to all that we consider human, democratic, dignified in humanity. Cuba is actually represents that for all of us, which is why the Cuba inspires. Cuba inspires by its example, not just Fidel, not just the leaders of Cuba, but the people of Cuba, the ordinary people of Cuba. And so many years after Fidel, they continue to inspire our shall we say, admiration. Very few countries in the world today have spoken up for Cuba. Among them, of course, the former president of Brazil, Lula, the current, of course, president of Mexico, Obrador. Bernie Sanders is a good example in the United States of someone who's, I think, spoken up on behalf of the Cuban people. And it's very interesting, the Western press and the way it's prejudiced, it's biased reportage on Cuba. I was surprised to read that repeated polls in the United States show that the majority of the people in the United States want the blockade to end. Even a fluctuating majority in Florida, the Cuban exiles, want the blockade to end. Then who is keeping this blockade? It's not in the interest of the American people. If America is a democracy, shouldn't it listen to its own people vis-a-vis Cuba? So this is purely a perverse, a kind of obdurate administration. Unfortunately, it's bipartisan in this case. And some of these concessions which were brought under the Obama regimes were, I think, removed. And as was mentioned, in the Trump era, some 234 fresh measures against Cuba were initiated. And therefore, Cuba continues to be beleaguered but proud. And that is what the inspiration of Cuba means for all of us. And that is why I think it's important for us to have this meeting. We are able to have the Zoom meeting. I understand that Zoom technology is forbidden to Cuba. So they can't. So communication is forbidden to Cuba. Information is forbidden to Cuba. It's only lopsided information about Cuba that is traded, spurious information that is peddled across the world. So that is what we are fighting. We are fighting an idea here, an idea of dignity, of honor, of democracy, of a people's representative right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Seshakumar. He mentioned the battle of ideas, which Fidel was very fond of, often repeating and asking us to indulge in. Thank you, Comrade Seshakumar. Now, I request Comrade Manoj Bhattacharya,
thank you very much.
Secretary of RSP.
Thank you very much, Comrade Arun Kumar,
Yes, Comrade.
for providing this opportunity to extend my gratitude to the Cuban people. And what I mean to say that to us, Cuba is a name of an emotion. It's emotion simply that infuses enthusiasm in us, that infuses revolutionism in us, and that infuses the righteousness, the value for democracy, the value for humanity to all of us. And I extend this, I take this opportunity at the outset to extend my solidarity, my feelings, heartfelt feelings for the Cuban people who have been fighting since more than 6 decades against the oppressive mentality of US imperialism or the imperialism as a whole. And I'll say this El Bloqueo, or what you call the blockade, is a vindication of the righteousness of the Cuban people, that they are the right path. They're the right path, because I remember very fondly, today it's a very historic day of Moncada Revolution or Moncada Rebellion, I'll say, in 1953, when Fidel Castro, along with 137 of his comrades, he attacked the barracks of Moncada and initiated the initial struggles against the Batista rule, against the wishes of the US imperialism. And after the completion of the 1959 revolution, the Cuban Revolution, Comrade Che Guevara, because I personally feel that it's only Cuba that could produce an international symbol of revolution, an international symbol of humanism, who was termed by Jean-Paul Sartre as the best human being of the last century, one of the finest human beings of the last century, Comrade Ernesto Che Guevara. Cuba has produced Ernesto Che Guevara. He carried the feelings of Cuba, the values of Cuba. And he told in one interview that what socialism begets, he was asked. And I read somewhere that he told that socialism begets a new man, devoid of all older values. And Cuba, I'm sure the people of Cuba in general, excepting a very minuscule minority, have inculcated that feelings that they are the new people. Che Guevara said that a new man will be born, the socialism will beget a new man, devoid of all older values. And today, the people of Cuba, they are devoid of all older values and fighting valiantly against the tirade of the imperialism. And Cuba is the only nation in the present century. Is the only country in the present century who really worked for internationalism. Cuba is the only country after revolution that the greatest, one of the greatest leaders of Cuba, Ernesto Che Guevara, he himself pioneered the movements against the atrocious regimes of Africa, in Latin America, and he has fought till his death on 9th October 1967, with unfortunate death in Valle Grande in Bolivia. However, what is pertinent today, what other speakers have also kindly commented, that the Cuba is under siege, and Cuba is not under siege for the first time. Cuba is under siege for long 62 years, almost 62 years, because America, the US imperialism, which is the headquarters of capitalism, the dilapidated capitalism as on today, cannot withstand Cuba to exist, because Cuba, the existence of Cuba itself is a threat to American imperialism, is a threat to capitalism, is a threat to all the forces which are anti-human, which are fighting to crush humanity, democracy, and freedom of the people. And US, as usual, they have simply crushed the democracies and the freedom-loving people of different parts of the world, including the Asian countries, including Iraq, including many other countries. How many I should name? US, after the Second World War, they have invaded, directly they have invaded nothing less than 60 countries to thwart their developments, to thwart the democracy, to thwart the values that they have nurtured. And US is such. So our indignation, our hatred against the imperialism, against the capitalism is full. And with that hatred, we extend our solidarity to Cuba, because Cuba is the only country, particularly in this pandemic situation. When Cuba could develop vaccines, Cuba difficulties that are facing since a very long time. They could develop vaccines, and those are much efficient vaccines than many other countries could produce. And now US is desperate. US is frustrated, USA is frustrated, and I also need to say, I also would point it out, that the democratic presidents, the presidents belonging to Democratic Party are more vicious than even Republicans. Donald Trump, I could understand. Donald Trump was to do it, and he has done. He has tightened the blockade further in the year now 2020. But now this Biden is betraying the cause of the democratic voice of America. Biden is betraying the cause of the democratic voice of America, who have voted for him, and could install the democratic forces in the power in the White House. But Biden is betraying them. So our indignation against them, our indignation against American imperialism, our indignation against the imperialism as a whole, including EU countries, they have also joined the blockade, because I know it very well that only in the General Assembly, only USA and its puppet state Israel, they only opposed the lifting of blockade against on Cuba, I must say. And I'm sure that I also like to assure Comrade Juan Carlos that the people of India, even though India is also under a very serious situation, India is under retrograde rule of far right forces. As sometimes I mean to say that this Bolsonaro, Modi, and Donald Trump, as at one point of time, they were the three forces, or three people who have pioneered or who have spearheaded the advances of right reactionary forces all over the world, who have tried to kill, who have tried to sabotage the peace-loving people, who have tried to sabotage the feelings of the democratic people, democratic-minded people, and who have tried to advance the cause of this dilapidated and crisis-ridden capitalism. And I'll say that we shall, for the Revolutionary Socialist Party, I'll say, on behalf of the Revolutionary Socialist Party, that we shall extend our fullest support, fullest solidarity to the people of Cuba, come what may. In the past, in several occasions, we have stood for Cuba, and we shall continue to stand for Cuba, because Cuba is a symbol of democracy. Cuba is a symbol of socialism. Cuba is still a symbol of the righteousness of humanity. And I'm sure that Cuba will come out of this problem today as it's been faced because of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation by fake news, or spreading of fake news. And I'm sure that the people of Cuba, as they have been fighting since a very long time, will come out victorious. I don't like to extend further because there are many speakers I find, and many have spoken. I'll thank everybody, and I'll once again say saludos to the people of Cuba. Muchas gracias to the people of Cuba. They understand Spanish. I understand very little Spanish, and I'll use my little knowledge of Spanish. That muchas gracias, Comrade Fidel Castro's people, Fidel Castro's country, or all the people of Fidel Castro's country. And I once again extend my solidarity and my feelings for the Cuban people. They will certainly come out victorious against all sorts of onslaughts. Those are being let loose by the American imperialists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Comrade Manoj Bhattacharya. Now I request Professor Sundar Raman He's a global coordinator of People's Health Movement, and he was also instrumental in designing and helping in various public health policies even in our country, particularly states like Chhattisgarh. Professor Sundar Raman, Global Coordinator of People's Health Movement, will be speaking. After that, one of the young ministers of Kerala government, the Finance Minister of Kerala government, K.N. Balagopal, will be speaking after him.
Thank you for this honor of inviting me to speak. I have always been a great source, Cuba has always been a great source of inspiration to me personally throughout my life. And I must say that for the People's Health Movement globally, we have been in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. For a very long time, we have had meetings over there, our international summits in Cuba and in Palestine. And in both of these areas, we have been in active solidarity. It has a special relevance to the medical fraternity and to science movements and health movements, because what Cuba has done and continues to do in the area of health and public health is truly amazing. And it is a source of inspiration to all people who are working for seeing the visualization of health and healthcare as a global public good and as a right to all citizens. The Cuban health system is inspiring partly because of what it has done for its own people. It has one of the highest health workers to population ratio in any country in the world. And if you plot the Cuban system's performance against its GDP per capita, it's about one of the best performers on the world. When adjusted for its GDP, it performed even despite differences in GDP, even without adjusting for it, it would do much better, for example, on most parameters than the United States of India. Though the United States has been blocking it and doing particular harm to its healthcare, health outcomes as measured by key indicators like infant mortality are better in Cuba. But the other big story of Cuba is its international solidarity on the health front. More than 140,000 Cuban professionals are working in worked in over 67 countries. And as Shashi was pointing out, about 1/3 of the countries, they were completely free, and in 1/3 they were shared, and in 1/3 they were paid, but the huge workforce out there. Even today, out of 10,000 medical seats, 8,000 medical seats go to training of people from developing countries, especially the poorer countries of Latin America and Africa, get their medical education over there. Their Henry Reed's international medical brigades have performed in earthquakes, have performed in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak, in Chile, and now recently in COVID-19, where more than 53 medical brigades have been performing right now in 39 countries. That's a huge amount because no other country has been able to do anywhere near this level of medical assistance that it has provided. Partly helped by the fact that till January of this year, in the first 9 months of the pandemic, Cuba almost reported no case. Since then, it has been rising, and there's been a sharp peak in the last 2 months. It has forced them to pull back a lot. But still, I mean, imagine a country like Italy, which is one of the top 10 in its economic growth and one of the wealthiest countries in the world. In 2 of its cities, Turin and Crema, had medical brigades from Cuba, 52 doctors who had set up camp and provided health care for a number of months before the crisis was passed, and then they came back. And they went at the specific invitation of the Italian government. It's not something that it is only the third world governments that are having to do that. And then just look at what it is doing in the vaccines area. It has been able to engineer its own vaccines. Remember, this is not something that they have done for COVID. This is something they have done as part of a socialist approach to building of health systems. And as part of that, they were already self-dependent on 8 out of 11 vaccines that were in use. They were already a big vaccine manufacturer and being able to fund the poorer countries on that. And now they have not one, but 3 vaccines, 2 of them already in the field. One of them actually with technology transfers to places like Iran, where they are starting up companies. So you have the Abdallah vaccine, you have the Sobarna vaccine, and you have the Mambisa. The Mambisa, if it comes through, will be a nasal spray vaccine. So you have actually leaders in the vaccine field across this. And braving all of this is the fact that much of the supplies that are needed, much of the sort of things that are go exactly into preventing it, the sort of raw equipment, the transfers of technologies are particularly blockaded again. The US keeps contending that food and medicines are not blocked to Cuba in its sanctions. But this is far from the truth because of a number of procedural hassles, a number of collateral laws that it imposes on other countries and companies and corporations in dealing with Cuba. In effect, the Cubans have had to develop a high degree of self-reliance. More than 70% of its medicines and the majority of its vaccines are homegrown, and they have to do it in the area of the new development of vaccines also. So there is much, if I may say, to be inspired by Cuba. It points to the strength of a socialist alternative in the path of the development. There are few sources for inspiration in a world where autocratic governments have come to power under and have been strengthened in their power due to the pandemic. Just see, for example, what is happening in the other supporter other than the US, the only second country to block Cuba, Israel. And the People's Health Movement is now all out in mobilization of protest for freeing Shatta O'Day, who was arrested on July 7th, who is a healthcare provider, who's been providing healthcare to women and children in the West Bank. Is an organization that has been serving the Palestinian health thing for a long time. And she's been picked up, she's in shackles, been held in extreme conditions, and the accusations as of now have not been filed. And what do we have is this huge attack on Palestinian health. So you have a situation where Israel, within its area, has one of the highest amounts of vaccination in the world. And within the occupied territories in Palestine, you have one of the lowest amount of vaccination. You have actually very minimal access to vaccination, a clear discrimination and a breach of the Geneva Code by which in occupied territories it's supposed to provide health care. And not only do you not provide health care, you arrest the people who are providing health care. Look at the contrast. Look at the contrast between one imperialist power who prevents healthcare even under international rule and another third world power built in a spirit of solidarity who has not only provided healthcare for its own people, but has extended healthcare to much of the developing world. It is possible for many more countries to follow this path, and the inspiration that we draw from it on this day is something that I must really we must all uphold. So in solidarity with Cuba, on behalf of the People's Science Movement, the People's Health Movement, and much of the medical fraternity in India who have always looked at Cuba as the alternative to our crass profit-making, profit-driven systems in much of the rest of the imperialist world, our salutations and solidarity. Thank you.
Comrade, thank you, Professor Sundararaman. Now I request Comrade K.N. Balagopal, who was a former leader of the student movement, youth movement, actively involved in the World Federation of Democratic Youth, and now himself experiencing firsthand the difficulties of running a state with all physical constraints. Comrade K.N. Balagopal, Minister of Finance, Government of Kerala. Balagopal, unmute. Balagopal, unmute. Balagopal, unmute. After Balagopal, it will be Professor Malini Bhattacharya.
Okay.
Yes, Comrade Balagopal, you are audible now.
Thank you, Comrade Arun. Dear comrades and friends and Comrade Carlos from Cuban Embassy. So first of all, I express our very, very strong solidarity to the people of Cuba and to the revolutionary government of Cuba. See, we know this is a very serious situation, and all the Comrade Carlos and Comrade Sitaram and Comrade Raja and all other speakers, they spoke about the situation. So it is not necessary to elaborate. So we have to give very strong support to the Cuban people and Cuban revolution. So first I am requesting that we have to do a lot of solidarity activity in the country, even amidst this situation. Some solidarity activity we have to strengthen in the country. And we know the history of Cuba, the revolution, it stands against the wretched history of slavery and imperialist domination. And that history and the historic revolution that gave us this strength of fight. We all experienced the desire of the people and the attitude of the people in the country. And I also had a personal experience to visit Cuba during our student days in 1997. It was the World Federation, the World Youth Festival, and it was the first festival in the world of this kind. That is the post-Soviet era. That was the first thing. So the International Preparatory Meeting, when we called the meeting in Delhi, the IPM meeting was there in Delhi, and almost all participants went there with their own cost. They supported, and we've done it with our own. That means the student and youth collected the money for that festival. So that festival was an experience, and we were there, and we had a practical experience of staying with the local people in the local villages. We stayed with the people of Cuba. The first-hand experience, how they think, how they believe, how is their assessment, and what is their feeling, that we had. So the local community, the vigor and inspiration and the spirit they had in their mind for strengthening the Cuban revolution and the government, that we experienced personally. The conduct of the festival and the arrangement and the political message, which that festival, the festival which was one of the